all right, thanks. I'm going to be speaking for about 25 to 30 minutes on the pioneering natural history collectors from Nepal. And this is part of a bicentenary year celebrations, a year of celebrations for the 200-year anniversary of the diplomatic link between Nepal and the UK. And as you'll see, the links with natural history go back more than that, extending more than 20 years before the diplomatic links. So we feel that within natural history we have a longer connection. I'd like to bring your attention to the bicentenary website, which is britainnepal.org, but also the next event as part of this calendar is a one-day symposium at the Zoological Society in Regent's Park. And it's a joint meeting between ZSL and the Linnean Society looking at success stories in biodiversity conservation in Nepal. That's on the 26th of February. You can go to the Zoological Society website where you can find more information about that. And members of the society, the Linnean Society, get a discounted rate. When I started working on the plants of Nepal around the year 2000, I was saying that I was working on the early collectors, and everybody was talking about Brian Hodgson and the fact that he was the pioneer of natural history collections in Nepal. And I hadn't really heard of him at the time, but I knew about the botanical collectors and wondered why they weren't getting any prominence. And then when I started looking into it, things like the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1911 had a marvelous misprint in it, which said he was the greatest authority on the Himalayan flora. Well, of course, that should be fauna. And maybe that started the ball rolling. But then there were other more recent things, like Carol Inskip and Mark Cocker's work on Hodgson as the Himalayan ornithologist, which acknowledged that there were 3 Europeans who were interested in natural history, who had visited Nepal, but their influence, their contributions were relatively minor compared to his. She listed Colonel Fitzpatrick, well, that should be Kirkpatrick, Buchanan Hamilton, and then Nathaniel Wallach. And then in 2002, there was a whole day symposium at the Royal Asiatic Society led by David Waterhouse, and that emphasized Hodgson's role, and the botanists really didn't feature very prominently. So hopefully, in this series of lectures and some of the publications of my work, I'll be able to redress this balance. So today, I'm going to try and give you a very brief overview of some of those the botanical pioneers and their collections and who they were working with. Certainly brush on Hodgson as the father of Himalayan zoology, and then hopefully show you that there is actually a balance between Hodgson and these other people. Turning first to the first expedition, if you like, into Nepal by Europeans, which was by William Kirkpatrick in 1793. At that point, Nepal really was a terra incognita. Nobody really knew much about Nepal. Europeans, very, very few Europeans had gone in there, certainly no people with natural history interests. This map here shows Nepal as being pretty featureless, maybe 1 or 2 towns and a few rivers. The Kirkpatrick expedition was only there for 7 weeks, but they got quite a lot of data together, and he published that in an account of the Kingdom of Nepal in 1811, which was the first real book on Nepal. Adam Freer was the surgeon naturalist on that trip with Kirkpatrick, and Freer was trained at Edinburgh. He learned his medicine at the University of Edinburgh, and as in common with many surgeons at that time, he was taught botany at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, under John Hope. People like William Roxburgh also followed the same suit. So this establishes my own institute's very long connection with Nepal, certainly going back more than 200 years. Now, in that book, there are some references to the plants they looked at, the vegetations they passed through, particularly some of the crops, but there are no botanical specimens or no zoological collections or no journals of Adam Freer's that we know of at the time. So really, the first collector of plants that we can acknowledge is Francis Buchanan Hamilton, who was the surgeon naturalist. He was trained in Edinburgh as well, with William Knox on their mission to Nepal in 1802. That was following a trade treaty and which allowed British presence in the Kathmandu Valley. It was tolerated just by the Nepalese Durbar at the time, and eventually, after 1 year, they all fell out and they had to retire. Buchanan Hamilton published his results in his own book of the same title, An Account of the Kingdom of Nepal, in retirement in 1819. But there's very little in the way of botanical or natural history interest in that, partly because all of his collections then were held by James Edward Smith, as we'll mention later. I'd like to point out that the person in charge of the military escort, Charles Crawford, he was a cartographer, and he produced this amazingly good map of the Kathmandu Valley, very detailed and incredibly accurate. The level of detail and accuracy wasn't to be equaled again for Kathmandu for 150 years later, so it really was ahead of its time. But it's very poorly known. There are only 2 copies known of this map in existence, one in the British Library, and another copy, which was Buchanan-Hamilton's original, is here at the Linnean Society of London. It's an extremely interesting map. So Buchanan-Hamilton was recording the natural history. He had drawings made by a Bengal artist from Calcutta, and 2 of the animals he portrayed was the Kalige pheasant and the Himalayan goral. There's an exhibition upstairs put together by Elaine Chowat, the librarian, or deputy librarian, and the Kalige pheasant is one of the things out on display, so have a look at that during coffee. He had illustrations of over 100 plant species, and this is just 3 of them. And these were painted by this Bengali artist, concentrating on plants which really didn't make good herbarium specimens. So there are a lot of orchids in there and succulent plants. This cymbidium on the end there is again one of the ones put out for display upstairs. So please have a look at that. When Kirkpatrick and Buchanan-Hamilton, when Knox and Buchanan-Hamilton went to Kathmandu, they would have travelled up this valley here, the Chitlong Valley, all the way through and into the Kathmandu Valley. And in fact, what they would have seen is very much what you will see now in the Chitlong Valley. Kathmandu was not built up then, it was incredibly agricultural. You would have seen intensive agriculture in the fertile plains, and then in the hills you will see covered in forests, mixed forests, and you can see the rhododendron arboreum in flower in March last year. And of course, the urban centres of Kathmandu, Bhaktapur and Patan with their rich architecture. Buchanan-Hamilton spent a year in Kathmandu, and he collected an enormous number of plant specimens. He reckons he collected 1,200 species, drawings, herbarium specimens, and records. Of those, he thought 800 species were new to science. That's a vast number, and it completely overwhelmed him. He started writing a manuscript flora of Nepalensis, but only got a third of the way through before he had to come back to the UK. And realizing that he wasn't able to continue his work because of the demands of his career, he left all of his collections to James Edward Smith, here looking like a young man, very different to the bust over in the corner. James Edward Smith then had the herbarium of specimens, and these are down in the Smith herbarium, the 100 or so drawings, and a few of those drawings have been facsimiles made, and they're on display in the back stairs going up to the tower room. And there's various manuscript notes here, which are pretty much in the same condition that Buchanan-Hamilton gave them over 200 years ago. So his collections really were the foundation of botanical study in Nepal, so we recognize him as the father of Nepalese botany. Well, Smith did relatively little with those collections. He almost immediately got picked out 12 of them and had James Sowerby redraw them and then published them in his own exotic botany. So there are 12 species in exotic botany based on Buchanan's collections. Here is Begonia picta. And then 10 years later, he decided to publish another 37 new species. These were included in Abraham Rees's Cyclopedia, but these are very, very small entries, very short descriptions, no illustrations. So it's quite difficult to apply those names and work out what Smith was actually meaning. You have to go back to the original material, so the drawings at the Linnean Society here and the specimens in the Smith Herbarium. So Smith published about 50 of those 800 species, and then after that, nothing more was done. The specimens, the drawings, and the manuscripts all stayed within his own collections, and he never had let anybody else use them and then they then passed to the Linnean Society, where they've stayed ever since. Buchanan Hamilton himself returned to Kathmandu returned to India in 1807 and took part in a very large survey of the Bengal presidency. The Bengal presidency is the big pink blob here at the top. This gave him a unique opportunity to do a lot of collecting and recording in northern India, and on 2 occasions he was on the Nepalese border. And although he wasn't able to go into Nepal himself, he sent in Indian collectors, and they collected plants and brought them to him. So he got collections from the Morang Hills and Palpa district. We reckon he got about 400 to 500 plant species from those 2 times on the border. He sent living plants to Calcutta, where they were grown by William Roxburgh in the Calcutta Botanic Garden. And he collected herbarium specimens, which he brought back to the UK in 1815. And then one set, his own set, is in Edinburgh, in the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, and the other set is now at the Royal Botanic Garden, Kew, as part of the Wallich collection. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to Nathaniel Wallach, and this portrait here is the one which is hanging in the stairs as we go up to the tea room. So when you go up to the library, have a look on the wall. There's this fantastic painting of Nathaniel Wallach in 1832. Most botanists have seen really ancient pictures of Wallach, but this is him as a much younger man. He was a Danish naturalist surgeon, and he was in charge of the Calcutta Botanic Garden from 1815 onwards. He himself visited Nepal in 1820, and it's important to remember that date, 1820, because some of the earlier collections from Nepal have been attributed to Wallach, but they were collected by someone else. And if you have a look at the display upstairs in the library, there's a little pine cone there which says, collected from Nepal by Wallach. Well, it wasn't collected by Wallach, and we'll come to that in a minute. He had a network of collectors and collaborators across the whole of India, and over a 20-year period, these people sent him specimens and he collected specimens. And in the end, he had about 9,000 species and about 20,000 specimens in many, many duplicates, which, when he was in London in 1828, he distributed in what we call the Wallachian distribution. This vast herbarium, the Herbarium of the East India Company, was the top set was presented to the Linnean Society in 1832, and duplicates of that were sent to more than 60 institutes and individuals in Europe. So a vast amount of material spread very widely, a huge scientific resource. This herbarium was then transferred to the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, in about 1914-15, and is now there as an independent collection ever since. And here's a picture of a Nepalese botanist working with those collections. Well, no talk on the natural history of the Himalaya is complete without at least a passing mention to Tomas Hardwick, a soldier who spent many, many years in India, and he collected one of the most extensive collections of Indian natural history drawings, and they're absolutely spectacular, like this flying squirrel and this rhododendron. He was really well connected with all the botanists and prominent in the Asiatic Society in Bengal. Although he didn't collect anything in Nepal himself, his connection with Nepal is this picture of Rhododendron arboreum. Rhododendron arboreum is Nepal's national flower, and from the drawings of that Hardwick sent back to Smith, Smith had this drawing redrawn by Sowerby, and it appears in the same volume as in Exotic Botany as the 12 species of Buchanan Hamilton. So he has a connection with Nepal, even though he didn't collect there. We then turn to the Treaty of Sigauli, which was signed after the Anglo-Nepal War in 1816 and marks the start of the 200-year relationship. That treaty established the presence of a British botanist or a British resident or diplomatic envoy in the Kathmandu Valley, and that was the start of the permanent diplomatic relationship. The first resident, or proto-ambassador if you like, was the Honourable Edward Gardner, who took up post in June or July 1816. And he knew Nathaniel Wallach, and Wallach wrote to him from Calcutta requesting that he send plant material. This was at the request of Buchanan Hamilton, who, when he left India, had told told Wallach that he must try and make every effort to try and get collections made from Nepal and other Himalayan countries. Well, Gardner wasn't a botanist himself. He didn't know what to do, but he said, if you can send me some local collectors, people to do it for you, I will look after them and make sure they can work. So Wallach sent two of his best collectors, the Indian Bharat Singh and the Portuguese Indian Francis de Silva, to Kathmandu, and they spent several years there under the supervision of Edward Gardner. Bharat Singh was collecting the plants and the seed, and De Silva was doing the preservation and the documentation and dispatching that back to Kathmandu. And so Gardner facilitated a huge number of plant collections, and a great number of specimens, herbarium specimens, were sent back to Wallach. Wallach wasn't keeping a herbarium at that time, so he sent all of the material, all those specimens, to the UK, and particularly to A.B. Lambert here in London. And Lambert distributed them to a few select people. James Edward Smith was one of those people, so he was fortunate again in getting the second set of plant material collected from Nepal. Deccan Dal in Geneva also benefited from some of these early collections. Wallach really appreciated the efforts that Gardner went to, and so he mentioned this. He named this rather splendid ginger, Hidicium gardnerianum, in his honour. Well, Gardner spent a year outside Kathmandu because he was seconded to one of the Indian native states, and his deputy, Robert Stewart, took over and supervised the collections. But unfortunately, Stewart didn't last very long. He succumbed to a rather nasty cold virus and died in March 1820, and probably was the first person buried in the British cemetery just outside the British Embassy. So this is the rather fine memorial to him in that garden. And the Wallach was particularly grateful for his role and named this Primula Stewartii after him. In describing Primula Stewartii, Wallach said that the Botanic Garden in Calcutta had lost one of its most zealous and liberal benefactors. So he made a big impact, even though he was only in post for just a few months. Well, those collections of Buchanan Hamilton and Edward Gardner through Wallach came back to A.B. Lambert and others, but A.B. Lambert had his own herbarium and decided that there were such useful collections that he would ask his curator and librarian, David Don, to study them and publish the first book on Nepal. Don did this, and in 1825 published Prodromus Flora Nepalensis, a very small book, but huge impact in Asian botany, because over 800 species were described, 77% or more were new to science. This is typical of an entry here. It's very short, no illustrations, a very short description, and many of the names like this Viburnum muller here were already proposed by Buchanan Hamilton in a manuscript format, and they were taken up by David Don. And here you can see the specimen citation, Swayambhu Nepali, i.e. Swayambhunath Monkey Temple, collected by Hamilton, or Buchanan Hamilton as he's known, and Wallach. So that specimen was not collected by Wallach, it was Edward Gardner. And yet again, some of these people just get lost in history. This is where Brian Hodgson comes in, because he was posted as an assistant resident to replace the unfortunate Robert Stewart. So he arrived in May 1820 and spent several years in Kathmandu, but at that point he had no apparent interest in natural history. He certainly made no collections. But he was there when Wallach was there in Kathmandu in 1820 for a year, and could well have helped Wallach, and most certainly would have been impressed by the huge volume of material that Wallach collected. Hodgson returns to Calcutta to take up what he thought was going to be a more lucrative or more career-enhancing position. If we turn to Wallach, and I've taken the liberty of turning him around here so he's facing us rather than away. He collected a vast amount of material. He had huge, almost like industry going there. Large numbers of living plants sent to Calcutta, boxes of seed for growing in Calcutta or for being sent back to the UK. Many of them were and grown here, and some of the first introductions from Nepal are from those seeds. A huge number of specimens, and I talked about those earlier, but also chests of wood samples and chests of what we call spirit collections of flowers and fruits. We don't know where collections have gone now. It's a possibility that some are at Kew, but the labelling is insufficient to really confirm that. He had this vast amount of collections, vast amount of information, and he started to publish it in Calcutta and started publishing the first 2 volumes of Tentamon Flora Nepalensis Illustrati, which was using this new technique of lithography, had only just been introduced into Calcutta or India a couple of years beforehand. And this was the first book illustrated by lithography printed in India. The illustrations I have here are some of the very, very rare coloured illustrations which are at the collections at Kew Gardens. Most of the other copies are uncoloured. But the quality, Wallach was unhappy with the quality of the reproduction and the quality of the painting, so he ceased production after 2 volumes. There were meant to be 12 volumes in total. And he was just about to come to the UK in 1828, so when he came here, he restarted the project and reformed it as Planta Asiatica Rariores, one of the best, most lavishly illustrated botanical books of the early 19th century. Again, 3 volumes, magnificent illustrations, huge, big book. If we return back to Hodgson and Nepal, he returned to Kathmandu, basically because he regained or ill health dogged him again, and he needed a better climate to live. Initially as the junior position as postmaster, and then back to assistant resident, and then officiating resident, and finally resident. It was at this time that he started looking at natural history, and he was pretty much a self-taught naturalist, zoologist. The first zoological notebook was in 1824, the date when he first got back. Then he published his first zoological paper in the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. That was on rhinos in 1825. First zoological specimen sent the next year. And I put in here the arrival of Archibald Campbell as the residency surgeon is important because Hodgson was self-taught and he didn't know how to do dissections properly. And Archibald Campbell taught him dissections and zoological anatomy, which enabled Hodgson to create these amazing drawings, which mostly now at the Zoological Society of London. And these drawings have very, very detailed anatomical as well as anatomical sketches to supplement these fantastic drawings. There's several volumes. I forgot, how many volumes have you got, Anne? We've got 6 volumes of birds and 2 volumes of plants. 6 volumes of birds, and they're big volumes, and they're full of these drawings. So if you get a chance to go and see the demonstration at the Zoological Society of London, I know you've got a display of those.
We've got a very big display of 8 huge panels in the aquarium at London Zoo.
It's fantastic. And so Hodgson's interests were very broad, all the way from, this is the Tibetan antelope where chartreuse wool is, which is made for the very high-grade pashminas. At that time, these horns started appearing, being sent down to India individually, and they thought it was the fabled unicorn, but Hodgson was able to procure a skull with both horns attached. It's the mythical unicorn, and this is named after him, Panthelops Hodgsoni. Of course, it's for ornithology that he's best known, and this is just one I can't hope to cover everything of his work, but just to give you an example of some of his zoological things. Again, the drawings are crammed full of observations, original observations on habitat, habit, and bird calls and so forth. His drawings are, as I say, at the Zoological Society of London, and some of them at the Natural History Museum, formerly the British Museum, and also the Royal Asiatic Society, and probably other learned societies. His actual specimens of birds are at the Natural History Museum. I think it's assumed that he, or calculated that he described, or at least documented, about 2/3 of all currently known mammals and birds of Nepal. And he also had an avid interest in some of the amphibians and the fish as well. So he was a very, very broad zoologist and laid the foundation of zoology. One of the untapped resources, which is now becoming becoming known is the Wallach Correspondence, which is held at Calcutta. Nathaniel Wallach wrote to many of the natural historians who were working in India at the time and back in Europe, and those letters he kept. And there are about 30 to 32 large volumes of these letters, which are now being preserved in the Calcutta Botanic Garden. I know Kew Gardens was one of the institutes involved in trying to put those into a more archival situation, and people are starting to work on those and look at the correspondence networks that Wallach had, showing how these people worked, how they communicated with each other, and this is an enormous resource which is starting to be tapped. Just to give you an example, just looking at the number of letters that Wallach received from Buchanan-Hamilton, Gardner, Stewart, and so forth. These are just numbers by year. This very first one here is Buchanan-Hamilton writing to him when he passed over the charge of the Calcutta Botanic Garden, and Buchanan-Hamilton in blue pops up pretty much every year until he died here. Now, considering it took 1 year for Buchanan to write a letter and then receive the answer, that's quite an active correspondence between somebody in the UK and somebody in India. But it shows a nice increase of Edward Gardner, when Edward Gardner was sending plants back to Calcutta. The green is Robert Stewart when he took over for that year. And then Brian Hodgson himself really starting to connect with Wallach here in 1824 after he returned and started to get interested in natural history in Kathmandu. And he keeps a sort of low-level correspondence. Wallach was in the UK here, so there's not surprisingly fewer letters at that point. And then a big explosion of letters here as Hodgson becomes resident, and it becomes part of his job to pursue some of those cards. Last two slides. Brian Hodgson and Joseph Dalton Hooker. One can spend a whole lecture talking about Hooker, and I know there have been talks here in the past. I just want to mention that there's a connection between Brian Hodgson and Joseph Hooker, which is down to his time in Darjeeling. This is a very young picture of Joseph Hooker, and that over there is a very old picture of Joseph Hooker, and that's his dad here. So Brian Hodgson went back to the Himalaya after retirement, and in 1845 settled in Darjeeling. And a few years later, the young Joseph Hooker came and stayed with him, and stayed for a couple of years at Bryanstone in Darjeeling. Hodgson was a huge influence on Hooker. If Hodgson hadn't been there, Hooker would not have made the impact in Himalayan botany, which he did. Hooker was a quite impoverished young man at that point, and the fact that Hodgson took him under his wing, paid for him to stay with him, and then paid for some of his travel, meant that Hooker could stay in the Himalayan region for far longer than he actually originally intended to, and made huge numbers of discoveries, particularly in rhododendrons and other flowering shrubs. Hodgson mentored the young Hooker. He taught him some of the connections, and because of his language skills, was able to find out far more from the local people about the uses of these plants and direct the local collectors to bring plants to Hooker. And in turn, Hooker encouraged Hodgson to write up his broad knowledge and document them in a much wider geographical summary. So they both benefited from each other. Certainly, Hooker valued Hodgson's input, and he named the really very remarkable rhododendron Hodgsoni after him, a spectacular one, which is hardy, and I have it growing in my garden, which is great. And Ligularia Hodgsoni. But I think more remarkable is Hodgsonia heteroclita, which is the drawing I had at the very start of this. Very few people, or natural historians, who had no connection with botany have genera named after them. So I think it's tantamount to the influence that Hodgson had over Hooker, that Hooker named an entirely new genus in Hodgson's honour. So my last slide. I hope that in this talk I've given you a brief summary of some of the pioneers in natural history. Hodgson is certainly by far the most major collector of zoological things. But there are many other botanists who I think their explorations have equally balanced Hodgson. If I was being biased, I'd say they did more, but I think we'll leave it equally balanced between the two. And people like Hardwick, who really spans the two disciplines. Thanks very much for listening this lunchtime. I'd encourage you to have a look at Wallich as you go up through to the library, and have a look at the display out there which Elaine Chowart's put out of some of the particularly Buchanan Hamilton material. And if you can, come along to the Zoological Society for that one-day meeting. Thank you very much.